So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Dorothy Advincula, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's Media Development Team. Dorothy, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are logging on from. Thank you for joining me and Tony today. It will be quite a jam-packed hour as we give you a preview of the latest information that can be found in our Ipsos Affluent survey. This year has been an unprecedented year to say the least, and even our research shows this, as you will soon see. What you'll hear today is data from our most recent fall 2020 release. Next slide, please. And I think next slide, please. Okay. The Ipsos Affluent study is part of Ipsos US Audience Measurement Group. Our other audience measurement solutions include TV Dailies, which is a continuously fielded study of American viewing and planned viewing of both traditional and streaming programs. Kids and Families, a study of what children in the US are doing throughout their day, including their media choices and activities. Streaming 360 is our newest product, currently in beta mode, exploring what is important to consumers in the rapidly expanding universe of offerings. Next slide, please. Coming back to the Affluent study, as many of you know, it is the longest running and most widely used study of affluence in the United States. Originally known as the Monroe-Mendelssohn study, it was purchased by Ipsos 13 years ago and rechristened as the Ipsos Affluent study. In 2015, the study was migrated from a mail-based survey to online data collection, enabling us to make significant improvements to the survey. It also allowed us to create custom recontact capabilities for clients. And these relatively short surveys come preloaded with the many thousand data points that have already been collected from respondents. The Affluent study is in field 24/7, virtually 365 days a year, with releases in spring and fall of each year and combining 12 months of continuous fielding. In addition, we release a double base survey or data set every summer that combines 2 years worth of interviewing to allow for higher sample sizes in order to develop insights on low incidence categories. Many of you are probably familiar with our quarterly barometers, which are surveys that recontact respondents to the main affluent study to gather in-depth insights on a range of subjects such as finance, travel, smart home technology, politics, and other topics of interest. So why all the fuss about the affluents? It's simple. They control the money. According to the Federal Reserve Board, the top 20% of U.S. earning households possess almost three-quarters of the total net worth in the U.S. And as the saying goes, the rich keep getting richer. Compared to 30 years ago, the affluent population has added $61 trillion in net worth, which is 2.8 times the total for the rest of the population. That means that the average affluent household gained more than 11 times what the average non-affluent household has. That accumulation of wealth is even more impressive when you see that the typical affluent household in the US outspends their non-affluent counterparts 2.5 to 1. And they outspend them in every category except for tobacco products. In some areas, like education, affluent households spend 5 times what non-affluent households spend. This is why every marketer needs to know who affluents really are and how to reach them. So who are the affluents? We define them as adults age 18 plus living in the U.S. households that earn $125,000 or more each year. Today, there are approximately 71.6 million of them, fairly evenly split among the genders, and success often takes two. So it's not surprising that 81% of affluents are married or in committed partnerships. Three-quarters of them have at least a bachelor's degree, and almost half of them have an advanced degree. The median household income is just under 185,000, and the median household net worth is 930,000. Although 1 in 4 affluents has a net worth of $2 million or more. And from this point, I think I would be introducing you to my co-presenter, Tony in Calcaterra, who's going to be going over the results from our fall 2020 release. Tony?
Thank you, Dorothy. So one of the great things about the study, we moved the study from a mail-based questionnaire where it had been fielded for over, close to 40 years, to an online study back in 2015. So thankfully, the Affluent survey was COVID-proof. There were no issues that we faced with, concerns about face-to-face interviews or really the need to institute methodological changes. So the majority of our interviews for the fall release did take place before COVID hit, but then 4,500 of them were conducted during COVID. So it gave us this unique opportunity to be able to look at the pre-COVID opinions and behaviors compared to those behaviors during COVID to see what kinds of changes may have taken place. Now the methodology was consistent, but we clearly saw differences in what the respondents were experiencing and doing in their lives. The mood of the country really darkened during this period, and there really was an increased need for information and, to a great degree, distraction from what was going on in people's lives. So news sources really became a lifeline for many to stay on top of what was happening and where it was happening. As well as how people could take care of themselves and their families. Doom scrolling, that phenomenon, really took hold as people continued to surf or scroll through bad news about COVID, and it almost became, an illness on its own, as people, were stuck at home, and they were just looking for news and information. Now, they turned in growing numbers and really in share of viewing to streaming services for needed distraction and entertainment at the same time. We saw millions of Americans laid off or furloughed. The stock market tumbled precipitously. But thankfully, affluents are nothing if not resilient. And despite the darkness, future intentions were relatively stable, as we'll see in a little bit. However, frankly, as restrictions were put into place, we began to see some future intentions, especially around travel, drop significantly. As we talked to clients, what was clear was their need to understand how things had changed under COVID and really what they could expect in the new reality. So as we set up the pre-COVID timeframe, we chose the cutoff of March 19th because we felt that this was really one of the strongest markers of when things became, quote unquote, real in the US. That was the date that California became the first state in the nation to issue shelter in place orders. And COVID really started to sink into the nation's consciousness, the zeitgeist. Within the next 3 weeks, frankly, from that point, virtually everyone in the country was under lockdown or under significant restrictions. And those restrictions really changed our lives and our behaviors quite dramatically. Homes became home offices, schoolrooms, and in many cases, sourdough bread bakeries, frankly, as the new sort of cocooning took place. And families literally were now spending 24 hours a day together with no break from each other. As COVID's grip on the country really took hold, many companies began massive layoffs and furloughs, driving the unemployment rate as high as 17% during that time. And according to the U.S. Census, their household pulse study, almost half of all U.S. adults experienced a loss of employment income starting March 13th. Now, the impact was disproportionately felt on lower income households. But as only a third of the households earning $100,000 or more experienced a loss. And the higher your income, the less likely you were to have experienced job income loss. Now, for all of those reasons, we felt the right thing to do was to power users of the fall study to be able to analyze data in multiple ways, particularly from the pre-COVID versus COVID side of things. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the mood darkened in the second quarter, really as we were experiencing the worst of the health and the financial fallout from COVID. We've been tracking optimism about the US economy since 2009, and for the past 7 years, optimism really has exceeded pessimism. For most of that time, the difference was exceedingly on the positive side. And that was until, frankly, April of this year, when Affluents became decidedly pessimistic on the outlook of the economy, really amidst the financial downturn of the country. When we queried respondents in September, after a few months of this, we started to see a positive attitude creep back in, so that now 44% of affluents are very or somewhat optimistic about the US economy moving forward. Men are far more hopeful in this respect than women, for whom pessimism still outranks optimism. But it's rather tenuous, it's very close, and we continue to keep an eye on this. For some time, we've also been reporting on a growing sense among affluents that the country was not moving in the right direction. In fact, 2/3 of affluents tell us now that the country is heading off on the wrong track. This delta between right direction and wrong track is what we call the satisfaction gap. And for some time, your political leanings were really the most indicative of where you fell on that scale. Since the last election, most Republicans have been right trackers, while most Democrats have been wrong trackers. However, frankly, as a general malaise set in the country, we were starting to see an increasing number of Americans that were dissatisfied with where things were headed. And today, 4 in 10 affluents state their dissatisfaction, 2/3 of independents, and 90% of Democrats believe things need to change. Now, of course, each side blames the other, with Democrats blaming Trump and the Republicans blaming the Democrats. But what's obvious in all of this is that few affluents are neutral. So that polarization that we're seeing in the rest of the country certainly exists among the affluent population. Now, it's no surprise, given everything that's going on, that the top concerns of affluents really center around COVID and its impact. Almost half of affluents rank COVID as one of their top concerns, with 25% saying a resurgence of COVID is their number one worry. The economy and healthcare rank second and third, both issues really that have been magnified due to COVID. But in addition, given all of the things that have been happening in the country, racial inequality and the scourge of systemic racism have really become part of affluents' top concerns, particularly as you look at the different generations. While affluents are fairly insulated financially, and we'll get into more of that a little bit later, nevertheless, concerns about the faltering economy and high unemployment bring with it questions that they seek from their financial advisors. They've told us specifically they want to know more about tax implications of the changes to their finances. They want advice on what they should be buying or selling. And they also want to know what the impact of all of this is on their retirement planning. They want to understand the financial implications from bills that are passed, along with data from the previous downturns, really in order to be able to better frame their response to the current situation. Now, while every generation considers COVID to be their top concern, beyond COVID, we start to see other things affecting the generations. And we really, for example, the younger generations, both Gen Z and millennials, are twice as likely to be worried about unemployment and the lack of jobs compared to their older counterparts. They're also far more likely to cite the racial inequality as one of their top 3 concerns, slightly higher even than their worries about healthcare. So given everything that's happening and has happened, where do affluents stand today in what we call their COVID consumer journey? Well, roughly half of affluents report that their jobs haven't been impacted by the pandemic. On the economic side, few of them have lost their jobs or been furloughed, although some of them have had to take salary reductions or been forced to take unpaid time off, had their work hours reduced, or even had bonus or commission plans temporarily discontinued. About 9% of them have said that their spouse or partner has been laid off or furloughed. So there clearly has been some financial impact on these families. But it's important to note that beyond financial, there are other impacts that are affecting affluent families. A large number of affluents have said that they are having to work longer hours or more days, or frankly, they've had to take on more responsibility to make up for coworkers who are no longer at the company. And these stressors were really on top of the need to work from home, often juggling these multiple responsibilities, including childcare and homeschooling. And all of this is happening without access to the typical things that affluents previously did to alleviate stress. Take beach vacations, spa visits, wonderful gourmet dinners out. Those are the kinds of things that traditionally have been able to offset some of the emotional difficulties or stressors in people's lives. Now, as I said before, affluents are really resilient. And even after 6 months of COVID restrictions and negative news, 2/3 of affluents are telling us that they're still confident in their financial security, and they're saying that they're going to come out of this relatively unscathed. Uh, when we first saw numbers like this in the beginning, we were concerned that over time, people would have a dimmer view, but this is held relatively consistent, that people are feeling like they're going to do well or come out of this well. Now, with the stock market returning back to higher levels, it's really not surprising that we also saw an increase, a 6% increase in the number of affluents who really said that their finances are strong enough to weather any economic fallout. On the less positive side, we still see that 1 in 4 feel that the financial downturn is going to have a detrimental effect on themselves and their families. And only a small portion feel that they're going to need to access additional resources, either by increasing debt or liquidating assets that they currently hold. Older affluents, the baby boomers and seniors, really as well as those with higher household net worth, are even more insulated, no surprise. They can survive and frankly even thrive during this crisis. These older generations really have previously weathered other recessions, and many of them have built up emergency funds, nest eggs, and equity. On the other hand, when we look at millennials, they're really facing a tougher road ahead. They had to deal with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, just as they were beginning their careers. And frankly, as a result, they had a harder time building their fortunes, building their nest eggs. To make matters worse for Gen Z and the millennials, they're really saddled with a tremendous amount of student loan debt. So it's not surprising that more than the other generations, Gen Z and millennials are more likely to fear the financial downturn as having a detrimental effect on themselves and their families. In addition, we see 1 in 4, roughly 28%, of these younger generations who are anticipating the need to take on debt in order to get through the next few months. Still, what we have seen is that they do recover and they can recover. So despite the challenges that really COVID has brought, the majority of affluents feel that they've adapted to the restrictions and settled into new routines. It's interesting to note that when we asked this question in May, a significant number of them were more hopeful that the restrictions would soon be lifted in their area. Now, with the resurgence in COVID cases across the country, when we went back and asked the same question just a few weeks ago, what we saw was more people felt that the hopefulness was dimming. So now when asked, 43% of them believe that it's going to take a year or more before we return to normal, and 9% feel that we're just never going to get back to normal. One of the things that we've always observed, and frankly it did not change that much, was that affluents are information junkies. Whether it's through traditional channels such as printed publications, or through newer media such as podcasts, affluents ingest a lot of media. So the fact is that that basic behavior didn't change. However, there were shifts within the media and how people were absorbing them. On average, when we look at the first 4 months of 2020, we saw very strong total brand footprint performances. And when we refer to total brand footprint, this is a measure of all of the exposure to a media brand over the course of 30 days. We measure more than 250 media brands. And when we looked at it, particularly when we compared the COVID months to the same time previously in the previous year, we saw strong increases. Now, this was based on what we call unweighted and unprojected sample that was collected between December of last year and May of this year. And as we were finishing up in June, as people got more adjusted and as this became more, as their lives became more adjusted, what we really saw was that the number of interviews during that time were too small to complete in this analysis. However, we started to see that levels were starting to come back to normal or come back to previous levels as we had seen over the last couple of years. The improvements in overall performance, though, compared to 2019 in those earlier months, really came from the digital assets of these brands. As time went on, as I said, they started to come back to normal, particularly as the country began to reopen in places, and suddenly people were not confined to home. So totals for the month of May were really much more in line with the numbers that we had seen for the previous year. And depending on the genre, the differences between 2020 and 2019 really vary, with some types gaining significantly more than others during the lockdown months. Now, as the hunger for news about the crisis mounted, the news brands did extremely well as those covering business and finance. So during the peak COVID lockdown months, news brands saw a 2.5 to 3 percentage point increase in total brand footprint compared to the same time period in 2019. The contribution of the digital assets, though, was responsible for most of the growth. And it should be noted that in April of this year, the digital assets were actually as large as the total brand assets were in April 2019. That month's total for digital brand footprint was almost 50% stronger than the same assets delivered in the previous year. Now, it was really the dual factors as for the thirst for information about what was going on, and the fact that normal distractions, trips, dinners were significantly less available to affluents that likely caused this increase in affluent exposure to media brands. While television viewing was already saturated in terms of net reach among affluents, the number of hours viewed in the past week increased by 20% during the COVID months. Social media hourly usage climbed about 10% during that same time frame. Now, we've all seen all the stories about increased adoption of new streaming video on demand services, and really as Americans scramble for access to additional content. And we clearly saw an increase among affluents with increased hourly usage leaping about 25% from pre-COVID to COVID. Print readership may have declined during COVID, But there was a substantial increase in the readership of the digital issues and the digital assets, really as affluents had less of an opportunity to stay on top of their favorite publications through the normal circumstances, either through reading physical copies that they bought or through seeing them in public places such as salons or office reception areas. Now, we also saw a large increase in exposure to podcasts during this time, again, as people were looking for ways to stay on top of news and to have that distraction. We talked briefly about the publication total brand footprint increasing during COVID, and I think this slide really helps to illustrate what transpired. On average, among the more than 100 publication brands that we measured, 30% of their total brand footprint came from affluents who only accessed printed copies in a normal year, while 35% came from affluents who accessed information from both printed copies and from the digital platforms for those brands. And the rest of that audience, on average, 35%, came from affluents who only accessed through their digital assets. During COVID, the contribution of the print-only impressions actually diminished. However, the sharp increase in the digital-only access more than made up for it. And this is particularly evident in the national newspaper numbers, where digital-only exposure grew to almost 2/3 of the total brand footprint. The traditional networks performed well during COVID, unless you had the misfortune to rely heavily on sports programming. So news organizations like CNN and Fox News really benefited from the increased need for information. And then entertainment powerhouses like HBO and Showtime really provided much of that needed distraction from what was going on with COVID. Despite significant declines in viewing levels for sports networks, they were still able to hold on to a significant portion of their affluent viewers. So, for example, you would think that there would have been a more severe loss, but ESPN lost only 25% of its viewers, and the average time spent viewing by those really only declined 9%. So, that was a true testament to the relationship that affluents have with sports. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was a sharp increase in the adoption of streaming video on-demand services. And in the average number of hours that affluents spent watching streaming video. When we looked at the past 7-day viewing for the top streaming video on-demand services, Netflix, which already had a huge penetration among affluents, saw their average weekly viewing hours rise 27% during COVID. Hulu enjoyed a 16% increase in the average number of hours. Now, with newcomers like Disney Plus, really, which had only been available since November, it watched the number of viewers more than double among affluents, but its average hours per viewer didn't increase all that much. But this was really likely due to the fact that the new additions did not yet have a chance to spend a lot of time exploring what the service had to offer, and we'll continue to monitor it and see just what is happening there. Now, we all know how much our lives changed as a result of the pandemic. Things that we took for granted were really no longer available to us, and we needed to find alternative approaches to others. The case in point, we're giving a virtual presentation today, which I think we've all become, quite accustomed to. I'm going to turn this over to my co-presenter, Dorothy, to take you through the next series of slides, where we're really talking about how core beliefs and attitudes were affected by the pandemic. So, Dorothy, over to you.
Thank you. So We all know how much our lives have changed as a result of the pandemic. I really love this topic, especially since we're able to let the data reveal to us what's really beneath the surfaces. So, this next few slides, we will showcase the power of our Ipsos affluent survey data to show you how we did some advanced analytics through perceptual mapping of these beliefs and attitudes to really see what could be going on. Um, so for the most part, psychographic measures in this slide and attitude statements did not vary tremendously during COVID. The 200 plus psychographics that we measure show a tight correlation. If you see that the scatter plot to the left of this chart, we show a tight correlation when comparing pre-COVID to COVID. However, there were some statements or beliefs that really spoke to the changing times, moving from a very positive outlook on the economy to sudden drops on Wall Street and a huge increase in job losses. We actually do see a 16 percentage point increase in the number of affluents telling us that they were worried about the state of the economy. So that's the top bar chart to the right. Likely reacting to this topsy-turvy conditions in the marketplace, it wasn't surprising to also see a 6 percentage point increase in the number of affluents who told us they keep up with the financial news. And then with so much focus on the need for technology to keep us connected, especially at work, it's also understandable to also see increase in things um, like cookie deletion. Like before, nobody or that fewer people cared about that. Um, but more and more people actually got into that habit because of the higher use of technology during this time, and also the need to stay on top of the new technological developments. Okay, so we're going to get to some of the more complicated but fun stuff. So, next slide, please. So using our usual methods of cross tabulations or charting or frequency tables, it can be difficult to see patterns when looking at data on a particular topic for a number of demographic groups across a series of psychographic questions. It's easily like a demographic by psychographic statements, right? So it would be helpful to be able to compare the pattern of responses between the demographic groups in order to see which are similar and where there are differences. And the same is true for the psychographic question. So, what about the interaction between those two? Are there beliefs that pop up for a particular group? So, using statistical techniques, we're able to create a two-dimensional picture or a perceptual map where these demographic groups are plotted as points. So if two groups wind up close together, then they're similar in terms of how they respond to the questions. If they're far apart, then they're fairly different. Even better, the psychographic statements can also be placed in the same picture as points. Again, if two questions are near each other, then they are answered in a similar way by the groups. And if they are far apart, then they are answered differently. The perceptual map allows us to see the interaction between the demographic groups and the psychographic statements. So if a psychographic statement is near a particular group and away from another, then the closer group stands out on that question relative to the other questions and groups. And this is where I use a superhero metaphor, because over here on our team, we love superheroes. And, we need superheroes during times like this. So in this example, we can fly the qualities or superpowers that superheroes might possess. As an example, we see qualities like flying and leaping over tall buildings are closely grouped together while far apart from just being human. When we overlay our heroes, so I think, yep, we see that Superman is closely aligned to his ability to fly and leap buildings, while the dynamic duo of Batman and Robin, who can't fly, are aligned to being human. Okay? So using the superhero example as a guide, let's look at real data from our fall release. I thought that that would somehow be a fun segue, given that, the mood is darkening a little bit. But now let's look at the real data from the fall release. So we can see that COVID had a little effect on our relation to fashion and shopping when we look at how the generations line up the psychographics. Whether we look at pre-COVID or during COVID data, Gen Z is closely related to the enjoyment of shopping for clothes, while millennials and Gen Xers are more closely associated with luxury products. In every generation, the impact of COVID made little difference in how they related to fashion. And on the other hand, the increasing concerns about the faltering economy had a strong pull towards the desire for security in the form of risk aversion, looking to others for financial advice, and thoughts about retirement. Gen Z, of which many are just beginning their careers, were most drawn to a state of concern, while millennials seem to have been least affected by this. So those closer to retirement or already retired are still feeling pretty secure and have money left over for a little indulgence, even if they're not able to get out and enjoy it. And then when we look at the relationships that we have with sports and entertainment, which is another thing that has been impacted by COVID lockdowns, perceptual mapping shows us that the African Americans and white affluents, the sudden dearth of live sports may have actually moved them closer to attitudes about fandom and the important role sports play in their lives. There wasn't much change for Hispanics or Asians from pre-COVID to COVID. So what these maps really tell us is that COVID sometimes serves as an agent, or crisis like COVID serves as an agent to bring us closer to who we really are, to amplify the concerns we used to not think about, and to contribute to our longing for things we used to enjoy. And next slide. But there is little change in stated future intention for respondents pre-COVID to COVID, which is likely the fact that the time period for future planning is based on next 12 months in their survey. Um, but affluents are hopefully still able to resume a great deal of normalcy in their lives soon and therefore still plan to do the things they love. So we did see declines in things that were impacted by external circumstances, such as travel restrictions, with future planning falling, though not terribly. On the other hand, in view of historically low interest rates, we also saw increases in things like refinancing mortgages and also investments. So the shuttering of gyms also brought a sharp increase in the purchase of home fitness equipment. There's a lot of those Zoom exercise things going on. And I can personally confirm that there is such a huge run on buying bicycles. There's a lot of bicycles happening in our neighborhood this month. So yeah, so these are the kind of behaviors that are being impacted in terms of like consumption by COVID. So in the next slide, please. So these are Tony, did you want to take this slide?
Yes.
Okay.
So, as the pandemic wore on, what we saw was that affluents were experiencing these very high levels of pent-up demand. They couldn't do certain things, they couldn't buy certain things. So really the desire showed up in the future intentions, and domestic travel really, which is always a huge part of affluents' lives, was the number one planned action in the next 6 months when we asked affluents. And this was the case when we asked them in May, and it was the case when we asked them in September. It really shows how closely aligned and how much affluents miss travel. Now, it's not happening tomorrow. I think people are being realistic, but they plan to travel soon. And really, second to travel, what we really see is with an eye on solidifying investment portfolios. Affluents are really fast to take advantage of the down market and invest in stocks, mutual funds, and other equities. Now, staying at home and the stay-at-home orders, really, with the need to work from home, led a lot of affluents to look around their homes and decide that it's time to redecorate, renovate, or remodel. I think all of us have seen the number of people in Home Depot and Lowe's over the last several months. And really with the double need to be productive for work and to provide the right technology for their kids to participate in remote learning, home technology is high on the list for short-term needs and purchases among affluents. And if I could advance the slide, we'd be all set. Okay, there we go. Now it is freezing. Okay. All right. Well, it's always a little dangerous when we make predictions about the future. But frankly, today I thought, let's throw caution to the wind and really gaze into the magic ball and see what we can tell you. Now, perhaps the biggest question that everyone has is, when are we going to be able to stop having Zoom happy hours and actually meet some friends in a bar or a restaurant for a drink? Well, according to our respondents to our recent September barometer, that date is September 26th of next year. So mark your calendars because we can actually all get to see each other then. And this, would actually allow us to go back to in-person meetings. And as we look at it, there's still a lot of pessimism out there about how long it's going to take. And there are even, almost 1 out of 10 are telling us that they just don't think we're ever going to get back to normal. But the truth of the matter is, even without COVID, we would still be experiencing a new normal when we look at affluence. In the last 6 years, Gen Z has almost tripled in terms of its representation in the affluent market. And really, as time marches on, this is going to continue to change the face of affluence. Their presence has really gotten so large. And frankly, right now, for the time being, boomers and seniors still have the most money. So their generation is still strategically important. But frankly, as these things continue, as time goes on, we're going to have to appeal to a different type of affluent. Now, as the older generations fade, the result is that affluents are going to look decidedly more multicultural. So 1 in 3 millennials and Gen Z affluents are non-white, compared to only 13% of seniors. And really, as a result of this increased diversification, marketers are going to need to tailor messages to appeal to different groups within the affluent population. So as I said, the new normal is going to take on a very different meaning because it will both impact what we can do and how we do it, but also, who makes up the economic power of the United States. So I know we've presented a great deal of information today, and I just thought I'd take a couple of minutes to recap what I feel are the most important points. From a media perspective, we clearly saw differences in how affluents used media after COVID hit. Now, at the same time, these changes seemed to moderate and return to more normal levels as time went on. It remains to be seen how a resurgence of COVID in the United States is going to affect media behavior. But it depends on a number of factors. Is it bad enough to slow the reopening of the economy, or worse? Will there be a need to reimpose restrictions or lockdowns and potentially have another lift in terms of media because people need the distraction and the information? For months, we've also talked about the resilience of the affluent population and this pent-up demand that's been building. While affluents have really adapted to the changes that were imposed because of COVID, the fact is they have a financial power that's going to allow them to re-enter the marketplace. And really, with their spending power, they're going to be vital to rebuilding the economy. And we believe they're going to be spending with a vengeance once they can. Now, in terms of stability, as Dorothy presented, our core values really haven't changed much as a result of the pandemic. Yet there are really some things that concern us, that continue to concern us about the strength of the economy. And also, as we look at our lives, For the most part, affluents still intend to pursue things in their lives that make them happy, and they're positioned to be able to do that as soon as they can. They have the money and the wherewithal. But lastly, regardless of what the lasting impacts or effects of the pandemic brings, affluents are going to look and react differently in the future. This younger generation is going to continue to take on a more dominant role among affluents, and we can expect them to look more multicultural, to bring a new set of values, and frankly, likely change the media and purchasing behaviors that have been in place for the last few years. So from our perspective, it's an exciting time to be researchers, continue to be able to measure and report on what we consider the most valuable group of people, the people who control 3/4 of the household net worth in the country, the people who outspend others 2.5 to 1. So that's, we hope that you have enjoyed the presentation today, and that we've given you some great insight into affluents, how COVID has impacted them, and what we think will happen moving forward. So Ellen, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you all for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dorothy and Tony. Now, we are at time, but there were some great questions coming in, and we will be answering those directly by email later today. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.